Welcome to the presentation on yoga pose information. My name is Christopher Turkley. I am a graduate student in instructional design at Western Governors University. Yoga pose information that should be planned before teaching a yoga class includes the following for each pose in the yoga sequence: step-by-step directions, proper form and alignment, modification, intensification, physical adjustment, an example from your personal experience, benefits, anecdote, and a suggestion for home practice. If I were to group them by what they accomplish in the class, step-by-step directions is about teaching. Proper form and alignment, modification, intensification, physical adjustment, example from your personal experience, are all about guiding students. Benefit, anecdote, and suggestion for home practice are all about helping the students transfer information from the class to life outside the yoga studio. Let's examine each of these in more detail. Step-by-step directions are simplified and easy to understand instructions that describe how to get into a pose. Keeping them simple will make it easier to teach and for students to follow. Focus on using simple sentences. Example of step-by-step directions for the bound angle pose. From seated, bend your knees so feet are flat on the floor. Drop your knees out to the sides. Press soles of the feet together. Bring heels close to the pelvis. Clasp big toes or ankles or shins. Lean forward, keeping your spine elongated. Proper form and alignment is the directions in which all major body parts are moving. The right and left leg, right and left arm, torso, hips, and head. This assists the students in understanding where the pose is taking them, so that they are constantly working in the pose. As a teacher, you understand that there is no mastering a pose. But a student may not understand this concept, so rather than explaining it to them, you state which directions the body is moving. This could be thought about as the edge. Example of proper form and alignment for the chair pose. Right and left leg are parallel to each other. Feet are pressing inferiorly. Right and left arm are parallel to each other. Fingers are reaching superiorly. Hips and torso are parallel to the front of the room. Top of the head is reaching superiorly. Eyes facing forward. Modification makes a pose easier. A modification adjusts aspects of a pose so a student with limitations can attempt it. You are creating modifications for those students who have a bad back, a bad knee, or a bad hip. It is useful to have 2 modifications for each pose, since it is hard to predict what type of limitation a student will have. This way you are prepared. An example of a modification for hero pose. Sit on a block, which is placed between the feet. Or place a rolled up mat or blanket between the thighs and calves. Intensification makes a pose harder or more challenging. And intensification adjusts aspects of the pose so a student who is not finding their edge in the pose can find their edge. It is useful to have at least 2 intensifications for each pose, since it is hard to predict which types of students will find a pose easy. An intensification may be necessary for a student who is very limber, because they are so flexible that they don't feel anything. The type of intensification recommended for this type of student is one that involves adding resistance or strength to the pose. An intensification for a student who is very strong will be to increase the time in the pose. In order to determine an intensification, you may need to think creatively about the pose, or find another plane in which to have the student practice the pose. An example of an intensification for monkey pose is to have the student practice the wall splits. Again, imagination may be necessary when deciding on intensifications. Physical adjustment is manually adjusting a student in a pose. This is a tool to help students realize the pose. Generally, you will be able to help a student become aware of other aspects of the pose that they cannot feel on their own. Use proper form and alignment as a guide. Pick one or two directions in which the body is moving and place your hands at the end points on the student's body, while asking them to move further into your hands. It is useful to be aware of two ways to physically adjust a student in each pose. An example of a physical adjustment for camel pose is to kneel in front of the student so you are facing them. Place your hands on the student's shoulder blades. Your arms are alongside their body. This helps lengthen the student's spine and opens their chest. Personal experience is your thoughts and feelings about the pose based upon your own experience. It offers insight into the pose that can only be gained from practicing it and not from reading a book. This could be thought of as what you like or dislike about a pose, or how you change the pose to suit your body. An example of personal experience for the crow pose. Two things that helped me with this pose. One is leaning and looking forward. Number two was lifting my butt up as high as I could in the air. Benefit is the physical and/or emotional benefit from practicing a pose. It is the reasons to practice yoga. This tells students the positive things about yoga. Example of the benefits for garland pose. Aids in digestion, stretches the ankles, lower hamstrings, back, and the neck, and also tones the abdominals. An anecdote is telling a story about a pose, either from real life or imaginary. This could include the story of the pose and how it got its name. This also allows students to associate the pose to something to which they can relate. An example of an anecdote for Lord of the Dance pose. Explain to students that is based on the statue of Shiva Nataraj, which symbolizes destruction and creation, as well as overcoming evil. Suggestion for home practice is offering a suggestion, often a modification of a pose, so students can easily practice it at home. It also reminds students to practice yoga regularly and helps students achieve their goals faster. An example of a suggestion for seated forward bend. Sit with your feet touching a wall as you practice this pose. Keep pressing your feet evenly into the wall throughout the pose. Yoga pose information is used to make sure you are fully prepared for class. It enables you to be a better teacher who is able to cater poses to students in the moment. While writing the yoga pose information, keep in mind the information learned from the learner analysis, motivation, and prerequisite skills in order to ensure that your class is customized to your students. You may ask, where do I find this information? There are many books out there with detailed yoga pose information as well as yoga pose benefits. There are also many websites with the same information. You can even ask veteran yoga teachers or practice the pose yourself. I thank you for watching this presentation, and I wish you much success in this workshop.